Okay, so I think we are going to start. My name is Julie Wilhelmsen. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And I should say, first of all, that this seminar will be streamed. So this seminar is part of the series, the NUPI series on global disorder and distrust. And today we will be talking about Russia. This is a long series. We have been talking about this issue in relation to the United States of America, in the Middle East, in China. We've had a seminar on distrust in global capitalism. But today our focus is on Russia, and in particular on the growing distrust between Russia and the West. And our guest, or should I rather say conversation partner here today, is Andrei Kortunov, who is the head of the Russian International Affairs Council. He is a very sharp, analytic, and a knowledgeable person, and also actually somebody I trust. So we're very, very happy that you could come and take part in this conversation. And we will try to address quite a few issues. We'll see how far we can get in the time we have, but we will address the larger question of Russia-West distrust, but also Norwegian-Russian relations, Russia's relation to global institutions, as well as single issues where Russia and the West maybe could start to collaborate, or alternatively where there are no possibilities of collaboration. So I think our starting point is this notion of a new Cold War, meaning that we have seen a new build-up of military forces in Europe on both sides. We also have, ironically, kind of an economic dimension to the new Cold War, in the sense that sanctions, economic levers are used in a fight between Russia and the West. It's not any longer so that economic collaboration is looked upon as a kind of a bridge, something to build trust between Russia and the West. And thirdly, there's a values dimension, maybe not an ideological dimension, but there certainly is a value dimension to the conflict, in terms of the two parties, if we should call them that, projecting their values as increasingly as opposite and incompatible. So I don't know if that picture is a bit too gloomy. It probably is, but nevertheless, there are deep issues of distrust between Russia and the West today. And some people are concerned of what might result from this. And I think, Andrei, that you are probably one of those people. And I thought I would start by asking you why you wrote a letter to John, which you wrote this spring, which I think John was kind of a shortcut for the Washington establishment, and you were trying to express a concern for where Russian-US relations were heading. So why did you write that letter? And secondly, what kind of response did you get?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that in the US political language, or rather colloquial language, Dear John letter usually is a letter which is written by a girlfriend to a boyfriend when she wants to part. And there is a cliche that, she probably caught him on, schmoozing with other girls or doing something wrong, and Dear John means that, well, we are separating. So, so there is a connotation here. But let me tell you that as a person who spent most of his professional career in academia as an expert, working with other experts, I am getting concerned, among other things which I am concerned about, I'm getting concerned about the quality of the academic discourse that we have now, both in Russia and in the West. I think that this quality is going down. And usually there was a firewall between research and propaganda, between analysis and advocacy. And academics have been rightfully proud of their ability to detach themselves from emotions of the day and to take a broader perspective on issues which politicians have to react to with all the constraints and limitations they have. What I see right now, both in Russia and in the West, is that unfortunately this discussion, in my opinion, is losing value. And we see that contrarian views are not really appreciated. Of course, in Russia, if you say something that might counter the official narrative, you might be accused of being a servant of the West. But likewise, in the West, if there is a view which differs from the mainstream, well, these are useful idiots, they are serving Putin. And I think that this is not right. I think this is something that we should, first of all, recognize as a problem, and second, deal with this problem. I quoted Weber in this letter, and Weber argued that there are two types of ethics. The ethics of principle. You stand by your principles. If Russia does something wrong, or if the West does something wrong, in your view, you have to speak out. You have to state your position. It's the ethic of principle. But there is a different ethic, which Weber also describes, and this is the ethics of responsibility. You should feel responsible. So when I talk to my American counterparts, and John is a kind of an American, a token American expert, I raise the question about what is the end game? I can understand, you don't like what Russia is doing. You believe that it is counterproductive. But do you think that the current situation, breaking contacts with Russia, trying to prevent Putin from seeing Trump, for example, is it something that will work? The situation is abnormal. And I think that we should really distinguish between two goals. One goal might be to punish Putin for what he is doing. And I don't want to get into discussion whether Putin deserves such a treatment, but I can imagine some people want to do that. But there is the other goal, to solve the problem. So my question is whether by punishing Putin you are getting closer to solving the problem with Russia. History teaches us that Russian leaders, and President Putin, one of them, usually don't yield under pressure. That might be a national tradition. So in Europe, they often say, well, we impose sanctions on Russia because there is the only thing that we can do. We cannot start a war with Moscow. But on the other hand, we cannot just accept what Moscow is doing. So the only way we can respond to Moscow's actions is by introducing sanctions. However, sanctions are not a substitute to a strategy. Fine. But then, where is the strategy? I look at the Mogherini 5 principles that is supposed to guide the European policies towards Russia, and frankly, I see very little substance here. They talk about selective engagement, but I never found a single document which would clarify what this selective engagement might mean. So this is why I wrote this letter, and I don't want to dwell on that in too much detail, but of course I received a couple of responses from my American friends and from my Russian friends as well, and usually these responses were very emotional. some would say that I am trying to be apologetic to the Russian leadership, which is wrong. Some would say that basically there is no point in talking to American experts because they are biased, they are opinionated, their judgments are politically loaded. So I'm not sure that I was able to initiate a substantive discussion on the issue. I hope that this discussion will still take place. But let me conclude by saying that I feel concerned about the role of experts and academics. Because when politicians make mistakes, when politicians go emotional, when politicians are limited by their specific agendas, which we see right now everywhere, I think the role of academics should grow. We should take responsibility to generate a vision, to take a balanced approach, to demonstrate some kind of resistance to the current political discourse. And if we don't do it, who is going to do it? So that's the problem I have.
Thank you. But then I wanted to take the opportunity to, after all, it's not the academics who created the level of distrust we have. So I wanted to just ask you, if you go back in time, and not more than 20 years, on the Russian side, what do you think is the core, the core events that have caused a distrust in the West, on the Russian political side I'm talking about now? And is this distrust, is it tied to the West in general? Or is there a difference between, how one looks upon the US or Europe or different countries in Europe?
Well, I think that to some extent we can argue that Russia had ungrounded expectations, like many of the countries that went through this very difficult transition from communism to a capitalist system. There were expectations that everything will be fine once we reject the idea of communism, and that the West would embrace us as a part of larger international community. And from the very outset, I think there was a bit of hypocrisy on both sides, which we tried to hide. Because the Russian position has always been that since the Cold War was over, and by the way, Russia never thought that it lost the Cold War. I do remember these days, the glorious days of the democratic revolution in Russia. Our perception was that we won, that it was not because the West imposed a new order on Russia, but because we decided to get rid of the old system, which proved to be inefficient. So there is a very different psychological framework compared. Let me just make one small deviation, since I started talking about that. Our neighbors and your neighbors in the Baltic region have many grievances and complaints about Russia. And when I talk to Europeans about how Russians could have dealt with the Baltic states differently, especially in Germany, they say, look, you should have learned from our experience after the Second World War. We felt that we really abused these small countries around us, that we ruined their economies, killed many people. Basically, we did many bad things. So we had to go through a process of repentance. We had to accept the crimes committed by the Nazi regime, and we had to cover an extra mile. Maybe, we did even more than these countries were entitled to, but that was important to change the pattern of the relationship. So why don't you do the same? And here I come back to this question of who won the Cold War, because Germans knew that they lost the Second World War. Germany was destroyed. The country capitulated. But in Russia, there was no sense of losing the Cold War. There was a sense of victory. And that's why the perception was that we liberated everybody, including, by the way, some of our neighboring nations. And that's why they should be grateful to us for our decision, because it was not a war of liberation. It was not a civil war there. And I think that Russians in the early 1990s, they expected gratitude, and they received resentment. That was one of the problems, psychological problems. I don't want to say that there were no reasons for resentment on the part of Baltic states, but that was not how it was perceived in Russia. And I think this is the major difference. But getting back to the issue of mistrust, I think that the perception of Russia was that once the Cold War was over, we should turn the page and start building together a new world order. New institutions, new rules of engagement, new principles. And partially this view was reflected in the Paris Charter. If you remember the Paris Charter of 1990, New Europe, Europe indivisible, free and united Europe based on OSCE as the core institution. And they started OSCE exactly in 1990. However, that was not the view here in the West. And in the West, the view was different. The perception was, well, we won. Our institutions prevailed, so why do we have to change anything? We should simply expand our institutions to incorporate other countries and other territories. So the West was not ready to turn the page and to start a new chapter. They want to continue their narrative. That's why eventually the European order did not emerge as an order around OSCE. It emerged as an order around NATO and the European Union. And if so, Russia had a problem. Either Russia should try to join the two institutions, which was extremely difficult for Russia for a variety of reasons, or it should accept its marginal position in the European and arguably in the global politics. If NATO is the only game in town, you're not a part of NATO, you're not in the game, right? So Russia tried, I think for a couple of years, they were trying to find some kind of accommodation, including the NATO-Russian Council. And here I get back to the issue of mistrust, because when the NATO-Russia Council was launched, the perception in Moscow was that, well, it will be the second pillar of the European security system, and it will be an important decision-making body, and no issue which might have a direct impact on Russian security will be considered outside of this framework. Of course, that was not the way the NATO-Russia Council was perceived in the West. And I had a chance to talk to some very high-level US politicians who were involved in building the council. They said, well, we need just to sweeten the pill. The pill being the NATO enlargement, of course. So the NATO-Russian Council has never been perceived as a real decision-making body. And I think that there is this ambiguity even in the Paris Charter, because in the West they like to refer to the clause in the Charter which stipulates that every European country has a right to choose its own alliances. If someone wants to join NATO, fine, no one can prevent or somehow oppose to this. But there is another clause right after that, is that you cannot, no country can promote its security at the expense of the security of its neighbors. And this is something that Russia usually refers to, because they say, if certain countries join NATO, it creates a very different geostrategic situation for Moscow, and basically we consider this enlargement as detrimental to our security because NATO still perceives Russia as one, if not the most important threat. So, getting back to distrust, I think that one of the sources of distrust was that we were not, I mean, on both sides, we were not bold enough, we were not courageous enough to address real problems. We tried to find some ways to hide them. You take the European Union, for example. Russia stated that, well, you know, we're not really happy with the pattern of operations which the European Union offers to smaller countries. And smaller countries, you know, it's acquis communautaire, basically. It's not real bilateral negotiation, it's negotiation about how these countries can gradually accept European EU standards, European procedures, regulations, and so on. Well, Russia was reluctant to do that. Russia always felt that because it is big, because it is different, there should be some kind of equal relationship. But the European Union cannot have an equal relationship with anyone because it is about acquis communautaire. It's not negotiable. It's just about how you move in the direction of European patterns. And that's what we saw. So basically the position of the West in certain ways, and again, you know, I don't want to sound apologetic to Russia because we made our own mistakes. Many serious mistakes going back to 1990s. But basically the position of the way of the West was, if I might use another, you know, American idiom, my way or highway. Either you play by my rules, and that's fine, though you will not be a part of our community in any case because you are too different, but you should play by our rules, or, you know, basically there is no deal. And ultimately, the decision of President Putin or whoever of the Russian establishment was, okay, let it be highway. But if it is highway, you shouldn't expect us to follow your traffic rules on this highway. And that's why, you know, we have what we have. That's why, you know, I really disagree with the notion that we lived happily till the Ukrainian crisis. That till 1914 everything was just fine, and suddenly, for God knows what reasons, Russia decided to violate the international law, to annex Crimea, and to provoke a crisis. This explanation, in my opinion, does not hold water, because even if we assume that Russia is the only side responsible for the Ukrainian crisis, it means that Russia could afford the crisis. And I think already by that time the trust was very low on the Russian side at least, but on the Western side, you know, I spoke to Barroso people in 2013, and they were already very distrustful of the Kremlin. I can tell you that for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting when you're talking. I'm thinking that probably distrust arose earlier on the Russian side, and now probably I should speak only for Norway, than it did in the West. And I think the reason was probably expectations, that everybody thought that in the 90s Russia would become like us in a way, and it would be an easy process. And then there was a lack of knowledge probably on what was really said and thought on the Russian side. So it took quite a long time. And I mean, there was really no strong Russian reaction to the NATO enlargement in 2004. At least I remember that's how we read it. So, and then there was, you know, some rising murmuring, I think, in particular with the war in Georgia in 2008. But in Norway, at least, 2014 is a watershed in terms of distrust, and it probably has with to do with the kind of the land grab and even the even Norway's identity as a small sovereign country and fairly newly independent country, that really was an act of which shocked Norwegian society. But then after that, I would say that it's quite amazing how these very deep images and deep distrust, which actually stems from the Cold War, the long Cold War, have just been, it's like a drawer which has been opened, and it's really easy to distrust absolutely everything Russia does. But I would say that 2014 is a watershed compared to what you're describing, which is kind of an evolving feeling that we are not, recognized and understood. But I would be interested to know, and I'm kind of pretending I don't know the Russian sphere, so I'm trying to mirror some of the prejudice on the Norwegian or Western side. So this question of, if there was no Putin regime, if there was no control over Russian television, then the kind of deep distrust in the West would not be there in the Russian population. To what extent is that true? And what are kind of the mechanisms of distrust in the West between the Russian leadership and the Russian people?
Well, I think that the gap between Russia and the West is the gap primarily at the level of political leadership. And in Russia, they now entertain the idea that we are not Europeans, we are Eurasians. I frankly find it very difficult to define what it means. To what extent Russians are really different from Europeans. Yes, one can say that Russians are more used to paternalistic social contract. But it is not different from Southern Europe, for example. It is not different from Central Europe, where many people still expect kind of paternalistic social contract from their states. Some would say that Russians are more religious than Europeans. I don't find a lot of factual or data that would confirm it. Some would say that Russians stand for traditional values. Again, I'm not sure that I will buy it. Look at statistics on marriages, divorces. No big difference. So socially, I think Russia is a European country, no matter what they say. And from this viewpoint, I think that when they say that Russia belongs to, let's say, BRICS, I think it's a misfit in the BRICS company. It's like, a senior citizen trying to get into a gang of teenagers. We are different, demographically, socially, economically. So I'm not sure that these coalitions will last for too long. Now, if you look at social attitudes towards the West, again, it's very hard to make a case for Russians turning away from Europe. We trust, let's say, the European education, because if there is a chance to get to Europe, to join a university in Europe, definitely many Russian youngsters would love to do that. We get more Schengen visas than any other country in the world, even now, after almost 5 years of the conflict. We have large Russian diasporas all over the place. There is no other single region of the world where you would have so many people speaking Russian. Tourism. You know, I got on flight here from Moscow. The plane was full with Russian tourists coming to Oslo. So even if you take oligarchs, you know, it is very interesting. They would prefer to sue each other in the High Court of London. You know. What does it mean? It means that there is a trust. They trust the British judiciary system arguably more than they trust their own system. So I would question this idea that, you know, Russians do not trust the West. However, of course, the trust at the political level is missing. And you can probably tell me much more than I can tell you about why the West doesn't trust Russia. But I think that there are reasons for the Russian leadership not to trust the West either. And for example, you take the United States, and I don't want to be judgmental about President Trump, but how you can trust a leadership which can change its position literally overnight. Take the P5+1 agreement on Iran. You know, commitments that were made by the Obama administration, and commitments that were basically, you know, ignored by the new administration. Inconsistency is definitely one of the features. But also, I think that in many ways it is a kind of self-projection. You take, let me give you just an example. You take Putin dealing with Xi Jinping on the one hand and with the European Union on the other. With Xi Jinping, it is very clear. I think they trust each other. They trust each other because they understand each other, because their views on the world more or less coincide. And the same can be said about a number of other leaders, including Erdogan, for example, including, to some extent, Indian Prime Minister Modi, Abe, a couple of other strong leaders that can make decisions and that can stand by their words. But the West is much more complicated system. There are checks and balances. There are changing political circumstances. So I think that it is psychologically easier to deal with strong, sometimes authoritarian leaders than to deal with democracies. You have to master this work. On the other hand, what I would say is that this is something that you should keep in mind. When Angela Merkel tells Vladimir Putin, no, you live in a different universe, she takes a condescending approach. It means that she regards President Putin as a very archaic, antiquated politician who sticks to the ideas of the 19th century. However, right now, with the current developments, with Donald Trump in charge in the White House, with populism growing all over the place in Europe, with the state system in the Middle East imploding, with the rising nationalism in East Asia, Vladimir Putin can tell Angela Merkel, yes, you are right. I live in a different universe, but you still have to prove to me that your universe is more real than mine. I am not a relict of the past. I am a prophet of the future. This is the world which will replace yours. And I think that as academics, as experts, we have to confess that the jury is still in session, that we don't know what this new world might look like. And there are many signs that confirm the viewpoint on the international system which is shared by Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. This is reality.
I think to speculate about the distrust on the Western side, it's at least to judge from what I hear, the main problem is a distrust in Russian practices, so to speak. That Russia operates with other types of practices which would be unacceptable in democracies. Now, I'm not saying I agree, and I also I'm a firm believer of that people are the same all over the world, so everybody can do good and bad, right and wrong. But still, I want to ask you the very bold question. Is there a stronger culture for lying or denying when you can achieve something by doing it? Not necessarily in Russian society, but in Russian foreign policy culture. And whether your answer is yes or no, I'm firmly convinced that this has become kind of a rhetorical commonplace in the Western milieu. And also in Norway, that this is, that's whatever you say, Russia, lies more than than other countries do in foreign when they operate in the world. So I would want to hear your opinion on that. Is it true, or is it just is it turning? I mean, for me, it's turning into such a huge concept in the West that we see Russian lies where they don't exist. So it's a problem on our side, but it's also a problem on the Russian side. Is there really a belief that you can achieve something by denying that you did it, even if you did it, or by simply lying about things?
Well, let me say that definitely there are some components in the contemporary Russian political culture which create problems. One of them is that I think there is almost an instinctive fear of openness. It, I think, gets back into history, and I think that the roots is in this fear of openness go to the sense of vulnerability. Vulnerability, because if we are open, Putin himself, I think he referred to that a couple of times in his recent speeches, that we were too open, and we opened, our, let's say, our information, our military. Americans were at every single defense plant, analyzing our missiles, and that was not good. They made use of it. They abused this openness. And I think that, but it goes deeper into history. The perception is that foreigners, if they have access to information, they will somehow use this access against our interests. We can speculate about how it emerged and how we should deal with them, but this is one of the problems. Another problem which I see when we talk about this denial is that traditionally it has always been very difficult, more difficult than for politicians in the West. It was difficult for Russian leaders to accept any mistakes, to recognize, well, you know, we were wrong. We were wrong, you know, we probably did something that we shouldn't have done. Again, you know, if I were to refer to one of the recent statements of the Russian president, he was asked very bluntly, you know, but can you, you know, confess any mistakes in foreign policy that you made? And it was not an easy question for him. And after some hesitation, he said, no, I think that my mistake was that I trusted the West too much. An interesting observation, right? So I think that partially, you know, this uneasiness in recognizing some mistakes or blunders is a product of the absence of real, you know, rotation of power. Because in the United States it is easy, and in many other countries it is easy. You have President Obama, he does something in foreign policy, then you have President Trump, and President Trump says, you know, whatever Obama did is wrong. It's stupid, it doesn't meet US interests, probably it is even high treason. And we really turn this page and we start from scratch. So there is no problem for a new US president to almost destroy, or at least in some very important ways to change the legacy of his predecessor. And to some extent, maybe to a small extent, but we have it in Europe. In Russia, only when we have a real, you know, change of the political system, then they say everything that, you know, Stalin did was wrong. And now I, Nikita Khrushchev, will do something very different, or you know, Boris Yeltsin rejected the legacy of the Soviet Union because it was a regime change. But when it gets down to, you know, business as usual, I think it is difficult for the political establishment to confess that sometimes Russia also makes mistakes, including foreign policy mistakes. And finally, let me say that you know, you referred to you know, this new tension. I think that in Russia, like in the West, there are institutions and people who were dormant over the last, you know, maybe 2 decades, and who now see that their time has come, and they're used to this Cold War situation. Maybe some of them believe that this is a normal situation. This is something that is unavoidable. So, in my opinion, right now, between Russia and the West, we should talk not as much about trust, because it is a high bar to reach. But I think that our immediate goal should be probably more modest. I would talk about predictability. You know, we should somehow interact, understanding what we can expect, because one of the problems is that this predictability, not to mention trust, is becoming very low. We don't know what to expect from each other, and that's why, you know, if we were to compare the current situation to the Cold War, I would qualify it. I would say that this is not the Cold War of 1970s or 1980s, when we had a system of consultations, information channels, arms control infrastructure, and things like that. It's the Cold War of early 1950s, when neither side knew what the red lines of the other side were. And finally, I think that, again, you know, this is very indicative that if we don't know what to expect from each other, we tend to accept the worst case scenario. So anything which is done here in the West or there in Russia is interpreted as a part of some kind of, large strategy which has very ambitious goals and should be regarded not as a probably some kind of improvisation, but something much more dangerous. And well, this is one of the problems that we have to deal with.
And I wanted to say, since you were so honest on the Russian side, that maybe in my eyes you're painting the picture of how honest or how easy it is to be honest about mistakes in the West a bit too rosy. Because I think we have this as part of our political system, but I think when you study what actually happens when our Western countries come into conflict with somebody else, be it, Iran or Russia, the ability to say that we did wrong disappears, because in order to kind of unite and fight against this enemy, you're very dependent on having a kind of clean-cut narrative where everything we did was right, everything you did was wrong. So I would say that, the narrative in relation to Russia on the Western side is not very modest and humble. It's usually a long row of everything Russia did wrong, and I think that is really a core problem here. And I'm as concerned as you about where it's taking us. And I think one thing which is striking is not only the similarity of narratives, but very all-encompassing notions of what the other does. And on the Russian side, I would say, the notion of NATO expansion is about encircling Russia, together with the notion of color revolutions, which basically can be anything. It can be me traveling to Russia, as a Westerner, engaging in something, and I'm part of a potential color revolution, which is a very, anything the West does will be kind of against Russia. And on our side, we have some very problematic such rhetorical commonplaces, and it's the notion of, for example, Russian hybrid warfare, which basically means that anything Russia does is part of a warring strategy in the information sphere, in the communication. Maybe even that you're sitting here, could be part of the Russian hybrid warfare to make us trust you more. So that really scares me, because what's left then between Russia and the West, with these all-encompassing negative notions and understanding of what the other wants. And the other point I wanted to make on the Western side is this notion of, Russia is set on bringing down our democratic Western societies. This is a sentence which reverberates in our in the discourse on the Western side. To what extent is it true? This is the question I wanted to ask you. To what extent is it true that Russia has a strategy against the US, against European societies, to break down Western democracies?
Well, I can tell you that maybe I don't have access to some top secret confidential plans, but I know nothing about such a strategy. And I don't know anyone who would know anything about that. If you take the official Russian position on, let's say, election involvement, the official Russian position is very clear and very linear. We never did, we do not do, we will never do. Just get lost. We don't do such things. Although even President Putin, some of his statements referred that, well, maybe there are some patriotic hackers who decided to expose the wrongdoings of, let's say, the National Committee of the Democratic Party in the United States during the election campaign of 2016. But the Russian government has nothing to do with these efforts, so it's not our problem, it's your problem. Now, if you want to take my opinion, and I might be dead wrong, of course, but my opinion is the following, that the Russian leadership has always been very concerned about what it perceived to be the Western interference into Russian domestic process. And indeed, you know, I watched it, and definitely there are tons of evidence that the West tried to influence political developments in Russia, even in the Soviet Union. You know, so this engagement goes back to the late Soviet Union years, and that has always been a matter of concern. You know, you are getting involved, and you are so sophisticated, you are so shrewd in staging all these colored revolutions, and it is very difficult for us to convince you that you shouldn't do that. And I think that what happened over the last couple of years is not, again, this is my interpretation, and might be very subjective one, but my interpretation is that what happened over the last couple of years was not a deliberate strategy to bring Western democracies down, to create chaos, but it was a signal. And the signal was that, look, folks, if you live in the house of glass, you shouldn't throw stones at your neighbor's windows. That's why, you know, I can tell you it was very interesting. John Bolton came to Moscow to prepare the Helsinki meeting between Trump and Putin. And there was a group of Americans there and a group of Russians, and we discussed this issue because they wanted to get some commitments from Russia that Russia would not interfere into the US political process. And it was clear that there were two things that Russia couldn't do. Well, first of all, Russia could not deviate from the stated narrative, so it could not recognize any state engagement in this interference. But second, Russia couldn't make and was not willing to make a unilateral commitment. So the perception on the Russian side was, okay, folks, you know, you don't want to recognize that you interfered in our affairs. Fine, though we have some proof. We don't want to recognize that we ever interfered into your political process, though you claim it was the case. Let's agree that from now on, you know, neither side would interfere into each other domestic affairs. And, you know, we will sign this deal. We will find ways to monitor the implementation of this agreement on both sides, and we will live happily ever after. Sounds nice, but how you define interference? And that was exactly the stumbling block. That was, in my view, why Trump couldn't get out of Putin a commitment in Helsinki. Why, you know, we are still struggling with that. Because, again, I'm sorry for being maybe too simplistic, but in the end of the day, the Western position is that, well, you know, we do interfere, but this is fine because we wish you well, and our interference is guided by best intentions. But your interference is bad because you are evil. And I can understand the emotions behind this position, but in terms of cutting a deal, it is very difficult. That's why, you know, we tried to reconcile the two views, you know, but for the United States it was either too much or too little, because if, you know, the position is that we should accept the Russian view on interference, then it would involve, for example, the US NGOs. And that would mean that Donald Trump should pick the line and call someone like George Soros and tell him, look, George, you know, we had a deal with Vladimir, so please, you know, keep your hands off Russia. You know, Trump cannot do that, and George Soros wouldn't listen to Donald Trump, even if Trump wanted to do that. But on the other hand, when Russians say, okay, let us limit this issue of interference into attempts to interfere into the counting process of votes, then Americans say, no, that's too little, because what about social networks? What about Facebook? What about direct mail to voters? What about Russia Today and fake news? And then Russians say, okay, you know, you want to discuss Russia Today? Let's discuss Voice of America. You are talking about Facebooks, but, you know, we can give you lots of examples when you use social networks in order to undermine President Putin or, you know, the Russian leadership. So it is really very difficult, and I don't think that there is an evident answer. But I think that we should somehow compartmentalize these issues. And my personal experience suggests that in terms of trust, you know, you cannot reach trust at the metaphysical level. You cannot, because it's about faith, it's not about facts. But when you get down to the level of professionals, to technicians, even on cyber, you know, I had a couple of experiences working with experts from the United States and from Russia. And, you know, these people usually find common language because it's not about, you know, these general holistic issues. It's about, you know, very specific mechanisms of breaching security systems or, you know, somehow falsifying election results. And we should start with issues where we can speak the same language. And once we do that, once we have trust, more trust among experts and professionals, we can probably gradually go up to the level of politicians and to public figures. But it will be a very slow and a very precarious movement.
And do you think it could, it would happen first on a bilateral level, or do you think there are certain institutions which could work well to start establishing practical collaboration? And if any institutions, then which of them?
Well, you know, I personally, I'm a strong believer in multilateral arrangements. I understand that multilateral mechanisms are more complicated than bilateral. There are more independent variables, and you are always in a minority, at least in some way. And that's why, you know, strong authoritarian leaders like Donald Trump, not to mention some others, are not very fond of multilateralism. They prefer to deal with their partners in the bilateral base because it gives them a clear advantage. They're big, they're strong, they're powerful. You know, if you deal with Canada and Mexico separate from each other, chances are high that you'll get what you want. But I think multilateralism is important. And I think multilateralism is important also because it allows to diffuse some problems at the bilateral level. And if we look to this part of Europe, you know, most successful cooperation models, in my opinion, were and are multilateral. You take Barents Secretariat. You know, issues that Russia might have with this or that country are dissolved within a broader framework. You take the Arctic Council. It's a multilateral arrangement which, in my humble opinion, is very successful. I would say surprisingly successful given the environment. Even if you take multilateral arrangements in the Baltic Sea, I think it is easier to drag some of our partners from Baltic states into a discussion when they feel that it's not them against this huge Russian bear, but it is in a multilateral framework. So I think that it might be easier, but multilateralism requires much more work, and I would say a different degree of professionalism. And I have to say, at least in my view, Russia is a big country, like the United States, like China, has not yet mastered this art of working, working in the framework of multilateral institutions. This is still something that we should learn. But I think that multilateralism is important.
So what about the UN as an arena for global cooperation? Is it true, as again, this is a kind of a Western commonplace, that Russia is kind of working to bring down the global order and disrupting the UN, so to speak?
Well, first of all, just imagine that the United Nations is gone. Will it serve any Russia's interests? Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, which puts Russia into the top league of the global politics. It allows Russia to prevent the actions of other major powers which it doesn't approve. It's an important vehicle. Arguably, it's one of the most important symbols of the Russian status and one of the most important instruments of the Russian foreign policy. So from this viewpoint, logically, Russia should not be interested in seeing the United Nations going down the drain. Now, in my opinion, the problem with the United Nations is that it's not just about Russia, it's about practically all the big five, the founding fathers, the countries which have a special status in the international system. I think they are not willing to make concessions because any changes in the way how the United Nations operates will mean a certain decrease of the authority in the system. The power is diffused. You have more members in the Security Council, you qualify the use of your veto power, and basically it means that your ability to influence the institution is likely to go down, not to go up. And the problem with this approach, if you try to keep everything, making no concessions, even on minor issues, you might lose everything in the end of the day. What we see happening today is that major international problems bypass the United Nations. The United Nations can do nothing on Syria, or almost nothing. It can do practically nothing on Ukraine. It can do almost nothing, well, probably slightly more, but not too much on North Korea. It can do nothing on Iran, and other issues. So you can see the United Nations getting marginal. And I think this is very dangerous. Having said that, I should also note that, in my opinion, we should not limit the question of the United Nations reform just to the composition of the Security Council or to the use of veto powers. Because the United Nations is a big institution, and there are many other issues that also deserve our attention. For example, the role of the Secretariat, their power and their authority, the authority of the Secretary General, or the resources which the United Nations needs to conduct its peacekeeping operations. It's clearly underfunded. the issue of UN bureaucracy. Again, you know, I'm not a great supporter of Donald Trump, but, you know, in some cases he's right. You know, I spent some time working on East River, and I can tell you that this is a very, very, you know, heavy, sometimes not very efficient, sometimes not very transparent institution, and there are some ethnic mafias there, let's face it, and there is a lot of waste in the United Nations. So, you know, we should not be shy to raise these questions. And when we say that we shouldn't even discuss them because that might jeopardize the United Nations, I think it's a lip service to the United Nations. So again, you know, I understand how difficult it is. I understand all the institutional inertia. I understand that, you know, there were many attempts at a reform of the United Nations. None of them was successful. But if we do nothing, I'm not sure that you know, the United Nations will play the role that it was supposed to play. So, in my opinion, it's a matter of any institution is as good or as bad as its constituent members want it to be. So it's about political will at the level of national governments. It's not a kind of, you know, mysterious institution that cannot be influenced. No, it is our institution, and we have to take actions to bring it back on track.
What about in the European context and organizations such as the OSCE? Do you think is there a I have a feeling sometimes that there's a deadlock in that organization. At the same time, it's probably an organization where Russia feels that it potentially is an equal partner compared to in other places, such as the NATO-Russia Council, for example. So what would be your views on that as a potential vehicle to reinvigorate
well, you
operation?
know, I think that it is a kind of fashionable to be critical of OSCE. OSCE is not for real. It's a small institution. Indeed, you know, even the legal status of OSCE is not clear. What is it? Is it an intergovernmental organization? No, it is not. Is it an NGO? Well, probably it is not. What is it? We don't know. There is no legal clarity on the OSCE status. But I keep thinking about the events in Ukraine. OSCE was the only institution which played a role. And again, you know, the crisis is not resolved. Unfortunately, you know, people are being killed there. But if there is an organization that played a positive role in preventing escalation and bringing this crisis into some kind of international perspective, it is OSCE. I used to work with the previous Secretary General, with Ambassador Zanier, and now it is Minister Greminger from Switzerland. And I can tell you that these are very committed and very able and, you know, very professional leaders who are trying to turn this institution to something more important and visible. There are some positive signs. For example, the structured dialogue. It was started 3 years ago when Germany was chairing the organization, but now it goes on. It is really one of the few remaining formats to discuss security issues. You mentioned the NATO-Russian Council, and though it resumed formally its meetings, I think anyone who follows it would say that it is almost completely formal. They exchange positions, and that's about it. NATO still has freeze on cooperation with the Russian military, so it will be difficult to change. I think the NATO-Russia Council has to be preserved, but I'm not very optimistic about its ability. But OSCE, if you take confidence-building measures in Europe, if you take soft security issues, if you take adjacent development matters, OSCE is the best thing we have. That's why, again, in my view, and not everybody in Moscow agrees to that, we should invest more in OSCE, even if sometimes Russia is criticized. You know, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and other things. Definitely, you know, it's not a rose garden for the Russian diplomacy. But as you mentioned, it is one of very few institutions in Europe where Russia is a full-fledged participant. So I think that the value of OSCE is now higher than it was 5 years ago, and I do hope that now, you know, unfortunately, Italy is presiding over OSCE this year, and unfortunately, Italians are distracted by many other issues. But you know, I think that OSCE is one of the mechanisms to gradually, slowly restore trust, which is missing right now.
Okay, so I can see that time is running, and ideally we would have time for a couple of questions. But before we move on to that, I want us to talk about Norway. And I know you're not a specialist on, it's not necessarily something you follow closely, but my observation would be that that Russia looks differently upon Norway in these past couple of years. And the reason I say that is that from the Russian embassy here in Oslo, there are often comments on things that Norway does, whether it is it's mostly, I suppose, with new arrangements in our security sphere. And they are very harsh, tough comments indicating that the Russian view of Norway has changed quite substantially. Would you know anything about that, and what do you think the reason is? And then I'll tell you afterwards what I think the reason is.
Well, I think that the case of Norway is very interesting because it shows how symbolic some of the traditional institutional allegiances and perceptions are compared to countries, Norway and Sweden. Norway is a NATO member, and definitely it is not just another NATO member, but it is a very important member to NATO. Your former Prime Minister is now leading the institution. Sweden is a neutral country. Moreover, Sweden almost eliminated its military forces. Unlike Finland, for example, you know, they definitely did not invest a lot into, at least until recently, they didn't invest too much into their military build-up. So the logic would suggest that Russia should have much better relations with Sweden than with Norway. However, it is not the case, as we know. And we know that attitudes towards Norway historically have been more positive than attitudes towards Sweden. Anti-Russian sentiments in Sweden, to the best of my knowledge, have always been stronger than in this country. So it tells you something about you know, the formal affiliation and the real picture. And I think that these special relations between Russia and Norway actually led to arguably inflated expectations about the role of Norway in this new Russian-Western dispute. I think that Putin had very good relations with your with your former prime minister, and he said, well, you know, with this person in charge of NATO, probably it will be easier for us to find some kind of accommodation with the Atlantic Alliance. I think that these inflated expectations almost inevitably resulted with frustrations. We counted on you, and what faults are you doing? You're letting NATO to the high north. You know, you are basically destroying, you know, this fragile balance which served our mutual interests. You're not a member of the European Union. Still, you know, you subscribe to sanctions, so we're not going to buy your salmon if you treat us this way. So I think that there was a frustration. There were some expectations, ungrounded expectations in certain ways, and there were some frustrations resulted from these expectations. But I think that if we take the Russian-Norwegian relations as such, I would compare this relationship to a matryoshka doll. There are a couple of figures there. If you take the bilateral relations, you know, again, maybe I don't know some details, and of course there are some unfortunate incidents. One of them happened just a couple of days ago about the so-called Russian spy penetrating the Norwegian parliament. But if we put them aside, I would say that there are not too many problems in the bilateral relationship. At least I don't see them now. The territorial dispute between Russia and Norway was resolved successfully. There are some relatively minor matters related to Spitsbergen and the Norwegian sovereignty, and, you know, there are some environmental issues. But again, you know, I don't think that these issues are that important. There were some incidents there close to Kirkenes, incidents regarding refugees coming to Norway through the Russian territory. But again, I don't think that this is a major problem in this relationship. So I think that if we take the bilateral dimension, there is nothing really that cannot be discussed and resolved. Now, there is the second layer is the regional dimension. And of course, we are talking about the Arctic cooperation, and I think that generally things are better than they could have been. And as I mentioned, in my opinion, the Arctic Council is doing a great job right now. The Finnish presidency is very successful, and the challenges that we face are not challenges within the Council. These are not challenges that result from some contradictions between member states. No. We have fewer disagreements with the United States than they have with Canadians about the Northwest Passage, which we all know. So in a way, the challenge is different. It's potential tensions between literal states and non-literal states. And I see the danger is that there might be temptation for any of member states to position themselves as lobbyists for non-literal states. For example, a Russian can say, you know, we will lobby for more active Chinese engagement in the Arctic region. And that would definitely raise eyebrows of other members. But the same can be said by someone else. You know, Americans can lobby for India, or, you know, Norway can lobby for the European Union, which I doubt it will, but it might. So I think that these problems are of a different type. And the only real issue there is that under certain circumstances, the Arctic Ocean can become a region of geostrategic, geopolitical competition. And here I come to the third level, and this is the level of the Russian-Western relations. And here I think we have much more serious contradictions and problems which affect relations between Russia and Norway. Because indeed, there are many in Russia who believe that we should invest much more in building our military capacity in the high north. you know, in the West, there are people who think that NATO should become much more active in this part of the world, and Norway is caught in the middle of this quarrel. And I think that that might potentially explode the relative stability which we have in this region, and this is something that will affect negatively all of us in the end of the day. But again, you know, I think that you are right in being critical of the state of the relationship between Russia and Norway, but things are not that bad. If you compare this relationship to some other bilateral relationships with which Russia has with some of its neighbors, I think you know, the situation is not perfect, but the situation is not that bad either.
No, I think you're right when you compare to other neighbors of Russia, but at least from my perspective, there's quite a big change in the last couple of years, and I think it has to do with Norway traditionally having two different and quite actually conflicting strategies, which used to be unproblematic but which have become problematic, and it is being Russia's partner in the north on the one hand, and on the other side being NATO in the north. And it's clear that since 2014 Norway has become much more NATO in the north. And I think probably there's a split in the government and in the Norwegian bureaucracy here, where you have a government which is very engaged in this project of Norway being NATO in the north, and then you have a bureaucracy which works much more on the bilateral level, trying to keep up the traditional cooperation in the fisheries, in search and rescue and all of that. But really what comes out into the public sphere is, of course, politicians talk. So the impression we sit with, at least as an audience outside of that, is that you have quite a strong miscommunication, which is not improving. So you have, on the one hand, this very angry Russian response to any move which Norway conceives of as small, you know, so we have 300 US Marines at Værnes on a rotational basis, which from the Norwegian perspective is just a tiny little thing, but from the Russian perspective is just looked upon as part of this, you know, NATO is encircling us. You have an enormously angry response. And then on the politician side here, you have a Norwegian elite who sometimes just dismisses anything Russia says as propaganda. So it means that you have this miscommunication, and that you're not actually starting to deal with things in a kind of low-key and practical fashion. It is, and that is, you know, that's a symptom of the level of distrust, I think, between these elites in Russia and in Norway.
You know, I can just give you one small lyrical digression. For many years, I worked together with Norwegian partners. It was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Barents Secretariat to some extent. We had a joint project on cross-border cooperation. It was Kirkenes and these places on the Russian side of the border, and we co-funded trans-border civil society contacts. My counterpart here was Rune Rafaelsen, who is now mayor of Kirkenes. At that point, he was in charge of this project from the Barents Secretariat side, and I had to deal with people and institutions on both sides of the border. And what was interesting is that they found more in common with each other than with respectively Moscow and Oslo. It was a kind of community.
Yes.
And you know, you are there on the south. You don't understand anything about what we are doing. You know, you do not appreciate, you know, our efforts. You do not have, enough understanding of our problems and so far. So, and unfortunately, I tried very hard to promote this model and maybe to expand it. I couldn't do it even during the best years of our cooperation. I think that is one of the problems. The political agenda dominates everything else. And it is understandable why it is the case, but I think that we should try not just to maintain, but to promote these other dimensions. For example, we have this geographical dispersed Arctic University, and I think that the center is here at Tromsø, I think, right? And I work with a number of universities in Russia, and they are, to say that they are interested in this cooperation is to say nothing. They are enthusiastic about that. And I think that we should not underestimate the importance of such projects. You take universities, they train future leaders. They shape public opinions. And it will not manifest itself tomorrow. It might take years. But I would consider such investment very seriously. And there are other opportunities. We can talk about NGOs. We can talk about this, interregional cooperation. So I think that if we are blocked at the top political level for unfortunate reasons, which we all know, it doesn't mean that we cannot and should not work at other levels and in other dimensions.
Okay, so on that very positive note, we have 2 minutes left. So
really?
I think, I see a couple of hands, but those cannot be comments. They will have to be a short question, and we'll take them both at once. So we have one here and one there. And okay, we have 4. So we take all those 4 questions in one, and then Andrei can answer, and then we have to wrap up.
Thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I'm an old age pensioner and independent analyst. Mr. Kartonov, you had some interesting comments on the notion of Eurasianism. You tended to dismiss the whole concept, and I'm very encouraged to hear that you very firmly declare that Russia is a European country. On the other hand, the leadership in Russia and in President Putin in particular uses let's say a terminology, vocabulary, rhetoric rather, which is heavily influenced by Eurasianist philosophers or propagandists like Alexander Dugin and even Lev Gumilov. He uses terms like Pasianarnost. He talks about the strategic partnership with China, etc. So my question to you is, Putin actually, does he miscalculate the mood of the Russian people? Or is there some kind of other explanation for this seemingly difference between the rhetoric and what you describe as the mood of the Russian people? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Lou Coatney, and first of all, I think Russian distrust started with Kosovo in 1999, and but you talked about bias, and Julie referred to the Putin regime, and you didn't challenge that. And we've had a lot of bad things going on in our countries. The Clinton administration, all the dead bodies around the Clintons and the Kosovo War, and the false flag 9/11 attack during Bush. And most recently, the disappearance of WikiLeaks' Kapuis here in Norway, Norway being militarized, the Nordic balance being overthrown. So why aren't you raising questions when somebody refers to Russia as being a national security country?
Hi, my name is Rick Bosch. I'm a U.S. policy commentator. Just a real fast comment. If you want to win the PR battle, just host the Eurovision Song Contest in Moscow, and you'll be pretty good to go as far as Europe's concerned, I think. Can you comment on the turn the Russian and China seemingly relationship now and going forward in the future, and specifically to the military exercises that took place recently?
There was one question there.
Yeah, I actually had 3 questions, but I'll keep
Pick the most important one.
my name is Branko. I'm an MGIMO graduate. I almost took an internship at RIAC, but didn't make it.
Really? Why?
Well, I needed a Norwegian passport, so I took an internship here in Oslo. But my question is, hasn't the boat sailed? Russia and China are working ever closer together, and now they are even trying to go away from the petrodollar. So isn't that almost a fait accompli, so that they don't need to work together with the West anymore?
Okay.
Okay, so these are not small questions, but let me try to address all of them. First of all, the issue of Eurasianism. I have to say that I don't think that people like Dugin have a serious impact on the Russian foreign policy. They might have some impact on part of the Russian public opinion, but not on the specific decision making. But to take it in a more serious way, I think that we should distinguish between identity and foreign policy priorities. The pivot to Asia is natural. Asia is the driving force of the global economy. Asia is about huge markets. Everybody, including Norway, I assume, should consider this pivot in this or that form. However, in my opinion, it is very important that this pivot, this change in priorities, should not compromise our identity. On the contrary, I would say that for Russia, if Russia really moves towards Asia, it is even more important to maintain and to emphasize its European identity. Let me give you just one example on that. In 1970s, there was a Japanese economic boom, and Australia decided to make full use of this boom. And they started working with Japanese in many various fields, including extraction, including agriculture, but also in some of the high-end sectors of the economy, and not just production, but also services. For Australia, for New Zealand, it was very important to demonstrate that they're different in order to get their niche in the Asian Pacific region. That they are different, that they can bring something that other Pacific or Asian countries do not have. So I think that for Russia it would be detrimental. I think it's impossible, so we shouldn't worry about that, but it would be detrimental to become an Asian country. It will be just another Asian country, not the biggest one, given the demographic trends, but in order to be functional and to be important, it has to be different. That's why I see no contradiction between the Asian pivot and the European identity. And speaking of the Eurasian identity, I simply don't understand what it means. What it means in terms of culture, what it means in terms of religion, of traditions. I don't see it anyone. In China, there is no Eurasian identity. In India, there is no Eurasian identity. What kind of identity they would like to think of? To design, I don't know. Identities, by the way, cannot be constructed. They have to emerge in a natural way. And even in this country, we see that you still have issue with identity because you are a relatively new country, and Scandinavian identity, Norwegian identity, Swedish identity. Well, again, don't want to get into that. Now, on this Kosovo, I have many issues to raise with the West. It's about Kosovo, it's about Iraq, it's about Libya, it's about many things. My personal guilt list is long. I'm very critical of the Western policy. Today we discuss Russia, and I don't want to engage, and I don't want to advise anyone to engage into the blame game. Because if you did something wrong, it does mean that it's a kind of excuse for us to do something wrong. And the other way around. I think that if Russia does something wrong in terms of the, I don't know, information war, for example, that the West should reciprocate in kind. I think that if we get into this cycle of blaming each other, it would be difficult to get out. So we should, I think each of us should have, first of all, some kind of introspection. What we do wrong, how we can change our behavior. It's the only way to affect the other side. But you are right, Kosovo was a turning point. It was the first instance when, people like Putin started thinking, well, they want us to act by the books, but they don't want to do it themselves. It was a manifestation in the Russian view of the Western hypocrisy. That's for sure. Kosovo was an important turning point. Now, in terms of Russia-China, I think that as long as President Putin and Chairman Xi are in charge, the Russian-Chinese relations will continue to be stable. It does mean that Russia and China will become formal partners. I think no one really, neither side wants it. They want to maintain a degree of flexibility, but they will continue to get closer. That's clear. Xi Jinping went to Vladivostok just recently, and Putin will be in China before too long. I think that the real danger for Russia and for many of us is a potential US-Chinese bipolarity. Because if the world becomes bipolar, all of us will have to take sides. And for Russia, that would be a real problem, because it means that, for example, Russia might lose its current stable and very positive relationship with India, because the Chinese-Indian tensions, unfortunately, are growing at this particular stage, and there are discussions of Indo-Pacific as an attempt to somehow contain China. We will not be able to pursue this entente with Japan, because Japan will definitely be on the side of the United States. So I think that these relations with China are important, and they will continue to be important, but they should not stop us from trying to diversify our political and economic investment portfolio in the Asian-Pacific region. That's why, I think that these relations with, for example, ASEAN countries, Putin will probably go to Singapore, are really important. And finally, let me just conclude with saying that sometimes they argue that the key choice that Russia has to make is the choice between Europe and Asia, between the East and the West, between the European Union and China. I think this is a wrong question, because in the end of the day, the real choice that Russia and many other countries, by the way, in the world have to make is a choice between self-isolation and integration. That's the real problem. Because you go to Shanghai and you'll see European companies all over the place there. And the Shanghai Yappies are not that different from younger people here in this city. So it's not about geographical preferences. It's about the ability to live and to prosper in the new world. And so far, what I'm concerned about is that in Russia, like again in many other countries, people take a very defensive position. The world is a rough place. We should protect ourselves. We should try to insulate ourselves. This is, I think it is really very, very risky because the world is getting smaller and problems are getting larger. And as in the, I don't know whether they watch here the Game of Thrones, but if they do, they know that the winter is coming. the winter is coming. And we can pretend that, nothing is happening, but problems are mounting in terms of, environment, in terms of resource crunch, in terms of the crisis of the international public law, in terms of migrations, because, this problem will not be resolved anytime soon. And either, we decide that, every man stands for himself, and we can somehow secure ourselves from the problems that others will have to deal with, or we finally decide that we should work together. And I think this is the real challenge that Russia faces today, because the immediate impulse is to build a wall and to forget about the rest.
Excellent. That was a very good final note to this seminar. So I'd like to thank you so much, both Andrei Kortunov and the audience, for coming. And then I would like to announce that this is, as I said initially, a part of a series, and we will have a new event like this in a couple of weeks' time with Ivan Krastsev, and he will be speaking on the political erosion of established liberal institutions, or something like that. So it's we'll keep up with, painting a rather gloomy picture of the world, but still trying to work on, where one can start to fix things. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.